Rahman.
It's such a topical thing to talk about, right? I mean, we're talking about disruption and what could be a bigger disruption of the moment than trade. So let me quickly introduce our panel. Yukon Huang is Senior Fellow at the Asia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. Jianping Zhang is the Director General of the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economy Cooperation and the Ministry of Commerce of the People's Republic of China. Gautam Bajnai is the chairman of Global Advisory Board of Campbell Lutens, who's based out of London, and Jens Hannefeld is the head of international policy for external relations and government relations at Volkswagen in Germany. A round of applause before we get into some very difficult conversations. So we're going to first play out what we're doing today. So let's start with the opening. Thank you for your presentation earlier, because that, I think, laid the groundwork for where we're headed. What does everyone make of, I don't like using the word trade war, so let's say tensions. Do you agree? Is this a war? Is this tension? Are you worried? Are you concerned? Jens, you want to start us off, since your company will be affected quite significantly? Mexico, China, it's spreading.
Well, yes, well, thank you very much indeed for having me here. And is it a trade war? Frankly speaking, I agree. I belong to the group of people who do not like the term war when we're talking about what we're seeing and experiencing right now. Is it disruptive and is it a challenge? Certainly, yes, there's no doubt about it. What we're seeing is a challenge to the established rules and practices of which we have all been engaged in doing business. It's clearly a challenge for a company like ours. Volkswagen is the largest European industrial company and employing about 600,000+ people the world over. And indeed active in virtually every part of the world with production facilities, etc., and a global sourcing network which relies on open markets, which relies on the ease and speed of transportation and interaction and also access to customers. So we are closely following what is going on right now in the world, and I would say we are concerned by what is happening. We are clearly very much interested in following and engaging in this debate to ensure that people actually understand the risks, but also potentially the opportunities which may arise out of the situation. So in brief, I'd say concerned, yes, sometimes worried, but we do not think it's time or cause for panic or anything like that. Quite on the contrary, I think this is a time to rethink and reconsider on how we do and business with each other and what the rules of the game should be in the future.
What about you, Jianping?
Yeah, definitely. I think that tariff measures cannot solve the problems facing with by all of economies. Meanwhile, today our topic is security. I'm afraid that by the name of security, new insecurity has been created. Today, all of us actually deeply worry about the potential global economic slowdown by trade measures. So for me, in the past 20 years, every year I'm studying on how to promote trade and investment liberalization and facilitation. But the first time since last year, I need to study what will be the effect by a new added tariff measures. So that's very amazing matters for us. Also, I think that right now we are talking about every 10 years there will be in the past decades, every 10 years there was a financial crisis or economic crisis. So last year, actually, everybody worry about the new round of economic crisis. So I'm afraid that tariff measures also, will make us facing with new round of, economic crisis, especially today due to globalization. Actually, every country and every person, you need to pay for the economic slowdown. Maybe you will lose your job, and you will suffer from the very heavy burden. So actually, this topic that is life support. I mean that every family, you need to pay the cost for economic slowdown and those tariff measures.
Yeah.
Especially,
Does China view this as a war or as simply tensions at this point?
Yeah. For Chinese side, I think that today, as biggest manufacturing center in the world, meanwhile, China is the biggest exporter, trade in goods country in the world. More than 130 countries, their biggest trade partners with Chinese side. By a word, that is China is producing products for global markets. So in case that China as driver of global trains, that means in case you beat up on the driver and the whole train will be slowed down. And maybe other countries, in case you want to import those products made in China, and then you will find that it's not easy, or maybe the cost will be higher a little bit. Also, I think that Chinese side right now, actually, we have enough capacity to deal with the possible, tariff measures or, trade conflict. That's because today in China, actually, our main economic driving force relying on domestic demand. More than 70, higher than 70%. China's,
Let's come back. I want to come back to that
export,
point,
not so
especially
high.
because your central bank governor has also been speaking over the last couple of days, and I know there's a meeting coming up on the weekend. Gordon, I want to get your perspective on this, because sitting in the city of London, and your perspectives from this part of the world, across the EU and in the US and in Asia, where you invest in the money flows. What is the money flow telling us about all of the rhetoric, all of the headlines that we read? How concerned is the financial market about this?
Extremely concerned, rightly, but the flows are not yet reflecting. But what the flows are reflecting is kind of uncertainty and insecurity, but there is no clear direction yet. I think that many of the decision makers in the city or in New York have not yet made up their mind. They are more in a follower position, and that's more characteristic of the whole world since the financial crisis in 2009 and 10, that it's not economic policy, it's political economy that rules the world. So the economy is trying to adapt to the political development. And I think it's a bit misleading to focus only on the trade war phenomenon. It's just a small part of a much bigger inflection point in the world, where a historic inflection point, which happened quite a few times in the last 2,000 years, that one emerging power is trying to take its place in the world, and the other power who set the rules before doesn't want to allow that. And this whole game is about who is going to set the rules in the next 100 years and who is going to follow the rules. We have been living, I lived all my life in the US-dominated world order. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, this became very obvious. And now China is growing into that, and it's not just want to grow into the US designed world order, taking those rules, but China wants to change those rules in its favor, which is quite understandable, but not very good for those who like the US world order. So I think that's what it is about. So trade is just one field where this game is played out. There are actually much more important fields in the background, technology clearly, finance, because finance is a very important way how leading countries exert their power. Think about the dollar as the global reserve currency versus the renminbi, which is very limited, and therefore it's limiting China's impact in that field. China has huge internal issues with the renminbi still. And then there is military and defense domination, partly related to the technology issue. And then investments. Investments are a tool, also a political tool to exert influence. China is using that. Think about the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is a way of building a Chinese way of influence in other parts of the world. So I see this as a global shift, potential shift. Graham Allison called it the Thucydides trap, when the emerging power is challenging the established power. The whole game is about who is setting the rules and who is accepting the rules. There is a saying in politics that if you are not at the table, you will be on the menu. And the question is whether you will be at the table or on the menu. And that's the big question for Europe.
Yeah.
Within that Central Europe, but it's a big question for Australia, Japan, Korea, and others who are equally dependent on both sides of the equation. So that's a big issue. And the reason it's played out in trade war, and that's my last thought, is this is the last moment when the US can still efficiently try to use trade to slow down China's emergence. Because about 10, 15 years ago, China's export was about 30% of GDP, 32% of GDP. Today it's around 18% of GDP. And in 10 years it will be around 10, 12% of GDP. So China's dependence on exports and therefore international trade is diminishing. So the coercion effect of trade as a tool, as a weapon in the hands of the US is diminishing. And that's what the US elite has realized is using.
I think that the two of you have much in common on that last point, and I want to come back to it, but I want to get your starting thoughts, Yukon, because you just gave that presentation that was quite impressive. The question here is, I think one that Gordon brings up, is technology at the end of the day. How much of that is going to play out?
Well, let me go back to a point you made. Are we in a trade war or not?
Yep.
And it's interesting to think about it. A month ago, practically everyone was positive, assuming that a trade deal will be forged. Today, everyone's very negative. So how do we go from a very negative situation to a very positive outlook, and then it's sort of like more like tensions, to a situation where people think there's a trade war coming? So you have on the China end, senior leaders looking at the whole package and seeing for the first time that this package looks like it contravenes national sovereignty. And this is a big issue at the very top. So that's changed, actually. If you look at the U.S. groupings, we have the White House, which is interested in trade deficits, business community interested in technology transfer, and the geostrategist politicians concerned about the great power rivalries. These three groups have, up to now, had different strategies in terms of how to deal with China. But they actually became unified a month ago into the same posture. And that basically changed the White House negotiating posture, because now they have a unity of three major groups in America towards saying, we don't want a deal right now. So my view is that we had what I call tension in the past up to now. Mm-hmm. We have a very strong likelihood that the future is going to be a trade war. Then the question is, how come we don't actually feel it? And the answer, of course, you don't feel it, because the loss in GDP growth so far is like 1/10 a point or two. But the next round of tariffs, if it plays out, and retaliations, you're basically seeing, as the fund predicted, a 0.5% decrease in global output this year. And that means much more for China than for America. But then you have the next year. And the cascading effect of that could mean a reduction in global growth by 1 percentage point next year. So you're going from 1/10 to a full 1. And then that 1 is measured by all sorts of things that some of these people in the business community can also measure. Movements in supply chains, disruptions in productivity, labor losses of a massive nature. We don't see it now. We don't feel it now. That's why the equity markets don't actually predict this. They're relatively, surprisingly, in some sense, still robust in America. So we're right now at the cusp of moving from what I call tensions to potentially a full-blown trade war.
I know I'm going to come to everyone for questions, and of course you have Slido to put up your questions, but I want to pick up on a point that this Monday, the CEO of Morgan Stanley in China, Wei-Sun Christensen, said very clearly, what everyone's forgetting at this point is that there's a bifurcation in the Chinese market. We have the consumer market where 98% have mobile phones, but in the industrial internet, it's not got up. So there's also this perception issue in the US, in Europe, that China's catching up, but it's actually not that fast. So why is everyone so worried if we're doing well or trying very hard, because it's going to take us time? Do you think, Jianping, that people are overestimating, based on the consumers that are available in China, how quickly China can take over and change the way the rules are at this point, the rules of the game?
Actually, firstly, I like to correct not One Belt, One Road initiative. Actually, from Chinese side, we mentioned the Belt and Road initiative because not only one belt, not only one road, many, many belt, many, many roads. Yeah. So on BRI, China is not trying to create a new set of rules and regulations. Actually, even if for global, cooperation, from Chinese side, our position is very clear to follow, existing global economic order, including WTO rules and regulations and financial, rules, something like that.
So you'd be comfortable with the American rules that were laid out many, many years ago, the world order that Gordon's talking about? You don't actually want to change it?
Actually, you know that the U.S. is leading the world for more than 100 years. And in the past 4 decades, I think that Chinese side, we are paying more attention on how to follow. Of course, we also are trying to negotiate so a lot of, bilateral and multilateral free trade agreements with other countries. In China, we also set up a series of free trade experimental zone. We are trying to explore, better trade and investment liberalization and facilitation rules and regulations. But however, I think that all of them based on international negotiations and based on, willingness from all of those parties. So in this regard, I think that today we have to pay more attention on a global, international labor division pattern. You know that today a global supply chain already linked all of those countries and the companies, even if consumers. Some of countries main playing role of, provider of resources and energy raw materials. Some of country produce valuable parts, and some of country provide related services. China as a, biggest assembler. Meanwhile, China as a biggest producer. Today, China also it seems that this year or next year, China will be the biggest consumers. So in this regard, of course, if you look at those developed countries, EU, United States, Japan, they are mainly playing a role of consumers. That's why their consumption demand is a very important driving force for global economic growth. So today, if you want to, decoupling, the relationship between China and the U.S. or decoupling other, business partnership, I'm afraid that there will be, disaster, and the cost will be very huge. Also, you can't imagine that in short term you can create, new global GVC, and you can have new, business partnership because that will take a long time.
Jens, this is a very valid point he makes. Jianping saying this is going to take time. There's a question up on that board which makes complete sense from Gunjan Waka. He says, and forgive me if it's a woman, what are the implications for Europe and Asian countries if the decoupling between US and China continues? Supply chain is one of the big things. You've got this presence in Mexico. We've got an issue brewing there. How do you view the position that VW finds itself in and the question of the German economy now being impacted, the trickle-out effect into the rest of Europe as well. We're kind of stuck in the middle, aren't we?
Well, I think indeed, and I think it's a very good question from Gudrun, because I think it's if we look at things from the European perspective, I think it raises the fundamental issue, and that's how do we respond to a situation which, if it continues unchecked, seems to be running towards a development where you are, unfortunately, in a way, sort of being pressurized into taking sides. And I think that's something which runs counter to our interests and to the established and proven patterns which we've been using in the past. At the end of the day, we have, on the basis of all necessary regulations and legal obligations, I think we have, and an international, based on an international framework, the WTO at the end, and plus a net of additional free trade agreements, I think we have been very successful in establishing a world order and a commercial order as well in this, a trade order, which allows us to take and benefit from all of the opportunities of which a globalized economy actually presents. And one of them certainly is the whole issue of scaling. And I think that's particularly an issue which is, I think, of great importance in this part of the world we're in right now. I mean, the German automotive industry has, it's not only Volkswagen, the Volkswagen Group, yes, indeed, is certainly a key player here as well, but has, in a way, created and developed an industrial base in the Eastern European countries, which is closely interlinked with the global trading patterns and terms of production. So, in a sense, as the German saying is, alles hängt mit allem zusammen, meaning everything is connected to everything, you actually do find yourself in a position where we are forced now to rethink these structures, while at the same time trying to maintain the fundamental and underlying principle. And I do mean scaling is one of these principles as a fundament of the global economic order, to ensure that this actually remains in place. And I think for European leaders, they are really charged with the difficult task to find a way for Europe, for the European Union, to make its voice heard in this chorus and in this debate, to ensure that this does not develop into what people would call a war, a trade war, whatever, but that this...
Is there a plan at Volkswagen at this point, looking at the fact that two of your major markets are looking extremely sensitive, let's use that word. Is there a plan in place to see what happens this weekend, happens next month, and in the next 6 months, since you managed to get a bit of a break, you've got a break from the White House for 6 months. Is there a plan in place if this all goes south for a German car manufacturer?
Well, let's put it this way. I think there's, and I think we're not the only ones with regard to that. I mean, we're actually closely monitoring.
I'm just using you as an example because you're sitting here.
Absolutely, and perfectly justified to do so. I think the fundamental challenge really is that companies have to focus far more on politics than they used to in the past. And they have to sort of see themselves in this political game to a greater extent than this was perhaps the case in the past. And making their points and arguments. And frankly speaking, I mean, we're very much speaking about the US-Chinese relationship at this point. I mean, this is definitely not the only issue out there. I mean, it is a big issue, there's no doubt about it. We have a particular set of issues between Europe and the United States. We also have issues between Europe and let's say, Russia. Also, the Chinese-European relationship presents its own set of challenges. There are opportunities as well. I mean, if we look at, let's say, EU-Mercosur, where we seem to be moving ahead with an important trade agreement there. At the same time, we don't have to go very far if we just look across the channel. And at Brexit, again, another very disruptive event taking place, which we need to take account of. Bentley, one of the UK car makers, is actually part of the Volkswagen Group. So we're not only affected with the fact that the UK is the second largest market in the European Union and is now sort of probably going to be ruled potentially by a different set of regulations, but we're also there as an employer. So what does that mean for a company like us? So all in all, yes, we constantly monitor this. We try to adapt to it, and we have to, otherwise I think that wouldn't really be a great future. At the same time, we're under no illusions that this is indeed a truly complicated question which we're dealing with here, and that at the end of the day, the fundamental principle of international trade has to be that everybody has the impression there's something in for it for us.
Yeah.
And we have to sort of make sure that we sort of provide this justification. And I think so it's not only a question about sort of saying, oh, he or they or whoever is wrong and is sort of not respecting us, but actually sort of going back, sort of thinking it through, sort of saying, okay, what do we or what can the various partners bring to the table, and where can we redefine the common benefit in these relationships? And I think that's what we're all called upon.
What are the benefits for us, Yukon? Because at some point you see many parts of this world, Brexit was mentioned, the US. At some point you start wondering whether these protectionist kind of movements in countries is all about the question of what's in it for us. That's just not being communicated. Do you see the sales pitch of, oh, you know what, it's actually the global trade is not as global as we think, it's all relatively regional, but even in regional issues, you're seeing problems.
Well, protectionism, if you look at it historically, always leads to inefficiency and reduction in global output. Now, companies protect themselves by shifting their location of activity because they want to minimize the damage. But they're minimizing the damage. They're not actually being able to produce more and be more efficient. So I think there's a delusion to think that anyone will come off better off. And it's interesting to me, when the IMF looked at this, it showed that China would suffer a lot, emerging markets would suffer a lot. But very few people realize that sections say that in the long term, America would actually suffer more. Because protectionism means that America would start to focus on certain protected kinds of industries. These are actually not America's high growth industries. Suppose that you break off the link between China and the US in the high tech sector in order to get at Huawei. So these are the major American companies in the high tech sector. Their total growth in production is selling to China. Now they're being told not to sell to China. So now you're blocking off America's leading innovative capacity from making money. And they won't be able to reinvest. They'll go into iron and steel and certain kinds of other products, which are not actually America's comparative advantage. So the IMF comes out with the view that in the short term, America may win, but in the long term, America loses. So my own view about this protectionist movement is we don't have any winners. We only have losers.
That's another question that we were talking about. Where is the money flow going? Is it actually flowing anymore? Are people really hesitant? And you were talking about a certain interesting aspect of investments in the Silicon Valley. I think that ties in quite well. Can you tell us a little bit more? Because at that point, you want to understand, where is their money being invested? Is money being pulled out? Are people holding on to their wallets, to simplify the matter? What is going on in that world?
So just a couple of empirical evidences. There's a lot of empirical evidence recently that a lot of manufacturing investments are coming out of China, going to Southeast Asia. So not going back to the US, but leaving China because of that insecurity. That short term, because you also asked who are the winners, and Southeast Asia short term is a winner. But if there is a real tension, if there is a prolonged cold war between these countries, like the analogy of the US Soviet Union Cold War, then in such situations, each of the alliances count who are their members, whose side are you on. Everybody will be asked in tense situations. And then what will South Korea, Singapore, Japan, or Australia do? These countries are traditionally part of the US kind of military security alliance. I asked this question last year in Australia from 3 government officials who deal with China, including one former prime minister. And each of them said, if that situation comes up, it's no clear we are the allies of the United States. And I said, all right, 25% of your exports, Australia, go to China. What will happen to you if there is an embargo, real sanctions? And what's the political economy of trade wars? First, People are happy because they have a new enemy on both sides. Nationalism always needs enemies. We see it in this region as well. But then, soon after, as the economic, there is a trade-off short term between identity politics and economic policy, but medium term, economic difficulties will prevail. So where will the, for example, Australian voters vote if 25% of their export collapses and jobs are lost? And that political vulnerabilities exist on both sides. But going back to your financial question, just two other empirical things. One is, one of the leading AI investors in the world is a Chinese private equity fund. They've just announced last week that they are closing their outlet in Silicon Valley because they are just being pushed back from every transaction. AI is probably the biggest issue in terms of the technology competition at the moment. And in the 5th generation of AI, China has the edge at the moment. So the US is trying to catch up. And the third interesting financial consideration. All right, if we take trade war is a fact for the coming years, as an investor, how do we react? And there are winners of the trade war. Protectionism always has short-term winners as well. If Huawei is banned with its technology from the US and parts of Western Europe, then somebody will need to deliver those technologies because 5G is here. It's already being rolled out. So the short-term biggest winners are not US companies. The US doesn't have 5G technology systems providers. It's Ericsson, Siemens, Nokia, European companies who are going to deliver those even to the US. So investors are trying to understand and pick the winners, but it's overall, investors are not happy about this because if the economy slows down, it will slow down, then the sustainability of pension systems, if it's sustained, will put in question.
I just want to ask you one quick question from one of our guests here. What are the implications for CEE countries, which are quote-unquote fans of China? I think you're best placed to answer that.
Well, so the CEE economies have become hugely integrated in Europe and through Europe into the global trading, free trading system, a multilateral order. That has brought tremendous benefits to our region. Just talking about my own country, Hungary, about 80% of our GDP is exports. We are one of the most open economies in Europe and in the world. For us, a significant slowdown in the global trade would be very severe hit. If you think about the German car industry, most of the manufacturing, a significant part of the German car manufacturing is outsourced to Central and Eastern Europe, not just Hungary. Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Poland, and some other countries. For us, a trade war in cars would be a disaster. Not just because of China, that's actually less of a threat for the car manufacturing industry. The biggest threat is the next deadline for Donald Trump. Because the United States is the one who is planning to implement car tariffs. And that would probably first and most immediately hit the Central and Eastern European countries. The second impending risk is a hard Brexit. The second largest market for the German car manufacturers in sort of external market outside the EU is, or still in the EU, is the UK.
Still in, for
still,
now.
Is the UK. So if you think about the two of the largest export markets are in clear and present danger, that's a huge risk for us. And in a broader sense, for smaller countries, and we have learned it in a very hard way through centuries, for smaller countries, a multilateral system where the smaller countries have rights against the larger ones and not just the other way around is much better than a pure balance of power or geopolitical play where usually smaller countries are on the losing end.
Well, Jianping and Jens, I want to ask you a simple question, and I'm not sure you'll want to answer it. Backroom conversations are where actual negotiations and talks happen. When you speak to companies that operate in China and their concerns, especially European companies, where 1/3 of them are now saying that we will be severely impacted in our business in China if trade tensions become wars. How do you reassure them that we're talking about European companies, How do you reassure people like Jens when they come talk to the Chinese market, the Chinese government, that yes, you should continue to believe in China. You're not going to end up being a pawn.
Actually, last year there is a very large corporation from Germany invested in Guangdong province. Investment about 10 billion US dollars. That's a very amazing case. So I think that for those corporations or companies from European countries, they are aiming for long-term business. In this regard, I think that in the long run, China will be the biggest market in the world. Meanwhile, China is in progress of upgrading of consumption. You may find that today, those China's middle class scale is expanding, and they are chasing, better cars and better living conditions, and international tour in different countries, and spend a lot, something like that. So I think that many foreign-funded enterprises in China, especially from EU countries, they are aiming for those markets. Of course, another very important point that is in China, actually we have so-called, in economics, we have industrial clustering effect as well as a scaling effect. You may find that today in any other country, you can't find another country like China. They have all of those industrial different sectors, subsectors, and if you want to create your business linkages from upstream to downstream, you can find it in a competing market. So that's why in China, actually, in recent years, every year China's foreign FDI inflow more than 130 billion US dollars. Especially right now in China, we set up more than 11 free trade experimental zones. In this year, there will be another, separate, free trade FTZ, concentrated more and more FDI inflow in service sectors and high-tech sectors. So I think that by this type of trend, for global business society, actually they are still, appreciate the value of China's market.
The back channeling, Jens, it's important for any company when they're investing large amounts of money into any one region. Are you reassured? Because a lot of European companies are worried about the Chinese market slowing down. We're talking about, the central bank governor saying we have enough room to maneuver in China. Don't worry about the renminbi. It'll be fine. We are a little worried about jobs, but we will create the programs necessary. What is the back channeling telling you?
I don't really think it's so much a question of back channeling, frankly speaking. It's more a question of simply looking at what's going on. And I think one thing which you can see right now, and I think that's because you were asking about concerns, yes, we are a little concerned if we look at the growth figures in China, particularly if we look at the automotive market, which hasn't been growing quite as much as it has in the past. At the same time, we indeed see China very much as an opportunity as well. It's this whole debate which is sort of being configured in the terms of threat and who's being threatened, etc. Is something which I think I wouldn't really subscribe to from our position. I mean, Volkswagen has been active in the Chinese market for really quite a while now. Really starting at very small company with one joint venture. We're partnered with Chinese companies in China, and we actually build in China for the Chinese customer. So the cars built in China are built for Chinese in China. So this is essentially a business model which sort of naturally means that we're closely related to and have a closely follow what is going on in the Chinese market, whether it's the regulatory aspects of it, but naturally also the consumption levels as well, and the trends. And we have important trends there like e-mobility and the like, which have implications for not only the Chinese market, but for the global developments in the automotive sector, for example. But it's not something which you would sort of see in the terms of a threat as such. I mean, we're looking at the economic well-being, and we're naturally interested in seeing this moving forward. And we have to sort of say, looking at the growth figures for the Chinese middle class, this is definitely going to be one of the, for the years to come, is still definitely going to be one of the few cases in the world with other important countries in Asia where we will see similar growth figures. We will not be seeing them either in Europe or in the United States, to be quite frank. These are essentially highly developed markets which have the appropriate saturation levels.
It really does explain the Chinese position when it then comes to the trade negotiations, if you're sitting and watching, because they know what they've got. I think that puts Rustam's question into perspective. What impact, he's asking, would the current situation, if prolonged, have on the digital economy and e-commerce, upon which many MSMEs are increasingly dependent? Now, domestically, we know how the Chinese digital economy works, but what about globally? How does it play out?
Well, I think this is a very difficult area. The developments have really occurred over the last decade or so. We don't have global rules. This is one of the key issues about WTO. WTO cannot deal with the digital economy. WTO cannot deal with the role of the state. WTO does not have explicit guidance on things like unfair subsidies. I mention these because this is part of this so-called tensions. And when WTO was created, it was never envisaged these issues would be big. Now you take the digital economy and e-commerce, and the question is China's activity in those areas, how has it impacted the world? Is it going to be a problem, or is it going to be a benefit? Having lived in China for several decades, and I first went back there for extended period in '96, I was sort of shocked because anyone who goes to a country, the first thing as an American does, you open up a checking account, you get a credit card, right? And I realized I never used my checking account. Then I realized I never used my credit card, okay? China skipped the whole stage and went to mobile payments. To me, it's an interesting question. The West has not. China has. Now, that's a tremendous advantage because e-commerce, the digital age, China is now way ahead of the rest of the world. So it went from a situation of being so-called protected, keeping out foreign companies, and the standard rule book would be they can't make progress because you can't make progress under protection. But I found it kind of strange. Not only did they make progress, but they actually exceeded the West because they had an opportunity to do something the West wouldn't move into. So I see this digital situation as kind of a unique kind of a situation playing out in ways which I had never foreseen. And then if you start controlling it more, which is likely to happen, we don't have rules of the game. So you're going to have some very ad hoc measures occurring on both sides. And again, I don't think this is fortunate. It goes back to artificial intelligence and 5G. We economists generally argue for free trade and letting the market work. I've come to the position, actually, that in areas like 5G or artificial intelligence, you have a unique kinds of economic situations where the guy who gets very big and gets there first creates a monopoly kind of position, which creates a sense of insecurity or security threats in the West and the world. And no matter whether you say they shouldn't feel this way, they will. Yeah. So you can't get around this. So my own view is we actually need a global system to start looking at questions like 5G. And if there's a concern, let's put in global regulatory standards and competition standards so people don't worry about it. Artificial intelligence, there's certain branches of artificial intelligence that if you make a lot of progress, it's not actually a private commercial good, it's a global good. So we actually have to put it in a mechanism by which that knowledge is uniformly shared like a public resource. We haven't done this. And because we haven't done this, we have this enormous tension between the West and China. And I don't think that can be resolved. It can only be resolved if we actually agree that we have a world now where these kinds of things never envisaged, we have no guidelines, we now have to basically create something. If we don't, these tensions that you begin with will just get worse.
I want to take a poll around this room because I do like doing physical polls, just so much more fun than technology. Who here thinks that the U.S. will be the worst off within a trade war? Raise your hand if you think that the U.S. will be the worst off in the globe. Let's make it medium term. Let's just make it in the medium term. Let's not go long term yet, because life is short. Who thinks China is going to be worse off in the medium term? Okay, that's pretty clear. Let's go long term now. Who thinks the US will be worse off long term if this is a war, a trade war? All right, don't have to bother asking the next question now, do I? Anyone have a question when it comes to this? I think the gentleman here.
My name is Liu Shizhong. I'm from Taiwan External Trade Development Councils. There's no country in the world than Taiwan that has been so heavily dependent on Chinese market. More than 40% of Taiwan's export goes to China in the past 2 decades. But even before the outbreak of the US-China trade war, we have seen incremental pulling out of Taiwanese companies of their business from Chinese market for natural reasons, rising labor wages, environmental issues, you name it. The trade war only accelerated this trend. So we have seen in the past 1 year, not only Taiwanese company in China, but also Chinese company. They are flowing to Vietnam, India, Indonesia, look for cheaper lands, cheaper labors.
And
so
the question?
Questions. Number one question to Dr. Huang, do you believe that there has been this kind of trade war has triggered a potential realignment of regional and global supply chain? Or as some suggested, a potential collapse of the race supply chain. And my second question, in fact, way beyond who is a loser, who is a winner, or who will be worse off, it's more about whether Chinese economy can sustain this kind of trade war.
I think it's for you.
So maybe.
Actually, you asked a whole set of questions which are a little bit too complicated to get into right now. But let me just take a crack at this. Taiwan money is moving out of China, and it's going to Southeast Asia. But actually, I just did a study on this. It's not actually going to Southeast Asia. 60% of the foreign investment flows that went to China are now going to the West Caribbean islands, tax havens. Okay? Surprisingly, half of that flows is going back to China, but not showing as coming from Taiwan. Okay? The other half is going to a whole range of countries. But essentially, what's happening is causing these kinds of dislocations, and it's actually getting hidden. Supply chain breakup means that countries are going to have to create duplicate supply chains, one aimed at China, one aiming at the US. So it means that the costs of goods globally will increase. That's how companies protect themselves. So companies' profits will fall, but they have to, because if they don't, they can't protect themselves. So this continues. You will have what I call increasingly duplicative productive structures, which doesn't serve anyone's purpose, basically.
I mean, can you take that as well?
Except just before we mentioned the consumption driving force. Second point, I think that right now China is promoting new round of reform and open up. If you look at in the past 2 years, Chinese side already, reduced our tariff level. According to, Minister saying from Mr. Wang Shouwen, he said that right now our, average tariff level just, about 7%, lower than most of, developing countries. Also, if you look at China's market access, nowadays we allowed Tesla set up their, independent, ventures, independent, branch in Shanghai. Also, if you look at Visa and Standard Poor, they already set up their branch, in China's market. If you look at China's auto sectors, financial sectors, service sectors, many of them, they already provide better market access, conditions.
But that's today. The question, I think, is can you sustain it? Can
yeah.
you sustain that domestic
I mean,
growth
more and
internally
more-
if there's a war?
Yeah, yeah. Of course, China can sustain by consumption.
But there will
yeah,
be job
by,
losses and on your end as well at some point.
By our, innovation and our competition, high-tech sector's competition, as well as by, our new, for investors concentrated in China. Also, I think that in China we have so a lot of human resources from high level to lower end, and then we may make our efforts, to deal with, the possible, barriers and difficulties.
Is there a concerted plan within China that if there is a full-blown trade war, all of these companies that are in China catering to the domestic market can stay there and have a market to access without a significant slowdown within consumption for, say, your lower level workers who may not have the export-driven jobs that they currently are in? Talking about the guys who are putting my Apple phone together, for example.
If you look at last year, China's FDI inflow, also China's domestic investment still, climbing up. Also, of course, I think that maybe, trade conflict may cause, some of China's production line maybe transfer to other countries. But it's not easy within 1 year or 2 years. For example, in China, the biggest assembler, smartphone assembler, Foxconn. Actually, Mr. Guo Taiming already claimed that in the next 10 years, gradually they will set up, production line in India. But the first one just started. So, I mean, I just had a kidding with a US friend. I told them, today you said that China has become a developed economy. So that's not true. Just because we are working for the iPhone. China's workers is working for the iPhone. So someday, Chinese workers, it's no need for Chinese worker to work for iPhone. Also, even if for Huawei smartphone, Xiaomi, MI smartphone, it's no need for Chinese, workers to assemble those type of products. Actually, other poor countries, maybe they can do that. All of those production line moving out of China.
It's the upskilling of the workers.
For Chinese brand, Chinese corporation, we just, responsible for R&D, branding, marketing, just like, iPhone, Apple model. At that time, you may say that, you may say, oh, China is developed economies. But today, we are still a biggest developing economy.
Let's get another question in.
Bobo Lowe, independent analyst. I'd like to fast forward 5 or so years and imagine a scenario where China, in the US worldview, assumes a rogue-like status similar to Iran today. And so the American government basically says, you're either for us or you're against us. How resilient do you think European states and institutions will be to this kind of US pressure?
Gordon.
So this question hasn't come up in the last 1-2 years. This question is on the table since the early 2000s. Manuel Barroso had a speech in 2005, so well before GFC, where he said, if things continue like this, in 30 years, the US will be the innovation center of the world, China will be the manufacturing center of the world, India will be the service center of the world, and Europe will be the museum of the world. And that was before the GFC. So for Europe this I see is the next phase of globalization, where China is an incredible success story from the political and welfare point of view. 40 years ago in China, 87.5% of the population lived on less than $2 a day. Today, 1.5% lives on less than $2 a day. So it's an incredible change. Therefore, that system is very stable. Now, for Europe, and to a degree US, this globalization has come up has shown signs of destabilization for the middle class. which has increased political instabilities, and the political economy of Europe and the US is very shaky. So short term, this conflict will be in the US decided by the preparation for the US elections and how the administration is playing the trade war in face of that.
Europe. Sorry, go ahead.
But for Europe, the question is, and this elections was, the outcome of the European Parliament election was positive from that point of view. If Europe can stick together, then it can remain at the table of negotiating the rules and forming the rules. If Europe falls apart, then even the largest economy, even the German economy, is no match to the US, the newly sort of self-centered US, not to mention China, militarily to Russia. So Europe has a chance to survive and actually be a significant player in this game if it can act together. And on trade policy, Europe is acting good together. On many other aspects, it doesn't. So going back to the previous question about the Central Eastern European countries' role within Europe and flirting with China, having several separate deals, I think the Central European countries' primary interest is also to stay together with the European, under the European umbrella, and negotiate as one unity with China, with the US, because that gives them strength. If it happens, then Europe can be long-term a stable factor in a very much more imbalanced world. If not, then Europe will go on an accelerated path to become a museum of the world.
The museum of the world is a scary thought indeed. Jens, to kind of put that into context from a corporate standpoint, when you are a multinational company like Volkswagen and your origin country is asked to pick a side to make a point, how do you then figure out how to run a business which employs so many people across the world and supplies goods to so many people around the world? Because as a corporate, your identity is less national and more multinational. How do you approach that if you have had to choose a side?
Yeah, I think the point is that approaching the issue under that figurehead, and I tried to point that out earlier, is, I think, not really helpful for us in any way. I think we should actually really try to prevent exactly that from happening. I think that taking sides, and it's not only a corporate thing, I think it's so clearly a challenge for a corporate entity, but it's also, I mean, when you ask the question, what are the risks and who's the winner and the loser, whatever, it's always difficult to define winners and losers, sometimes not, but in many cases.
I think there was a question up there, how do you define a winner and a loser?
But it's, but I have to say, I must admit, I do see a great risk for Europe in all of this, to be honest. And I think it has to do with the fact that Europe has to get, to put it bluntly, get its act together and actually define how it sees its role in this. And I think we need, and I think that we see some developments in the right direction, but at the end of the day, I think what we're seeing on the one hand side are interests, and then we have the fundamental question of, okay, interests are justified, you can't debate them away if countries voice them. You have to sort of see how you can accommodate them within a at least rules-based system, because that, after all, is the principle which we all align. And I think it's very important.
The corporates have lobby groups. You can influence.
Well, to be honest, I don't think it's the lobby groups which help you all that much at the end of the day. I mean, what we really need is, frankly speaking, a functioning WTO, for example.
Yep.
I think that's one of the things you really need. You need a framework in which all of this works. And I think.
How would you make the WTO work better?
Yeah, you know that. I think that we should appreciate WTO, role for global trade. We already.
But Jens is saying it's not working right. So how would you fix it?
Of course, we need to improve the function of WTO because in the past several decades, today WTO also is facing with a lot of new topics, new challenges, especially e-business. Environmental issues, sustainable development issues, as well as a subsidy headache problem. Yeah, so I think that I hope that the U.S. side could be back on the under the framework of WTO. That would be fair for all of players in global markets. Also, I think that for Chinese side, we are willing to work with all of those partners on GVC to support, WTO.
I like the wind around answer on that one, but we will wait and see. I have a one-sentence question for everybody, so just to end this. 2020, how much do you think it will change the trade tension, war, however you want to call it? How important are the elections in the United States to this?
Elections
One
are very
sentence
important.
each.
Only other thought is, who's the rogue nation by 2020? I actually think that America will be.
Gordon?
I think it's hugely important short term, but there is a much broader consensus in the US between Republicans and Democrats about challenging the China's emergence, but the elections will be played to a large extent around the trade question.
Jean-Luc?
I think no matter who will lead the U.S., rational, thinking for trade issues, economic issues would be the most important thing.
Jean?
Well, I think naturally elections in the US always tend to say something really totally obvious, very important. And so we'll all see how that plays out. I do think that they will strongly influence, the result will strongly influence the global trade agenda, but it will do so because it simply fuels a debate which is going on anyway.
Yep.
So I think that's what we'll be seeing in this context.
DC circles are going to be excited to hear that. On that note, gentlemen, thank you so very much for your time. Please, a round of applause for a fantastic panel. We're now going to move on to a very topical session. It's called US and Europe Still in It Together. I know a lot of you had questions in this session about this. Paul Taylor is going to be moderating this session, and I know it will be fantastic, so please do stick around. It's an important question, not just for 550 million citizens in this part of the world, but an entire country across the Atlantic. Paul is here. Paul, tell us a little bit about what you're going to talk about. Hi.
All right, I listened to this and we see each other. Yeah. Our conversation with Phil Rieker this morning really is still in it together, and the organizers have put a question mark at the end. Are the Americans and the Europeans still in it together? In NATO, in multilateralism, in Europe whole and free? Do we still care about the same values, the rule of law, democracy, and the freedom of media? And when it comes to trade, when it comes to tariffs, when it comes to extraterritorial sanctions, are we still in it together? So,
this isn't good. This is a
without
very
further
engaged
ado,
audience.
I'm going to
Thank you very much, and I can tell you this is a very engaged audience. Thank you very much for having me as well.
All the best. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to have with me today U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Phil Rieker. Phil, please come and join us.
That's the spot. Point, counterpoint.
Phil and I first met 20 years ago, almost today, in Rambouillet, which makes neither of us feel any younger, I think. But I want to start by having a thought for my father. 75 years ago this week, my father was waiting on Tilbury Dock with thousands of other British soldiers for his landing ship to take him to Normandy. He wasn't in D-Day. He arrived at about D+10. And by then, they'd built the Mulberry Harbor in Arromanches. Beside him were Americans, Czechs, Slovaks who were in the Allied forces. And in those days, it was clear what we were all in it together. And so our question today is, are we still in it together? And the organizers have put a question mark behind that. Now, somebody at on a panel I was on this morning made the extraordinary remark that we're only nowadays, we all know that we wake up every morning knowing we're only one tweet away from the dissolution of NATO. My American friends tell me I shouldn't worry too much about the tweets. I should look at the policy. So today we're really going to talk about the policy, Phil. We're going to avoid the minefield of tweets, if we can, and say, are we still together? And I think nobody is better qualified than you, somebody who knows Europe so well, somebody who's been here in the Western Balkans, who's been here at US EUCOM, and a real specialist on Europe. So I'm glad to have you with us.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks.
My first question then is, when it comes to NATO, are we still in it together? Do you Americans feel that you can still trust the Americans, the Europeans as allies?
I'm not taking the bait. Yeah.
And can we feel that we can that you're still with us?
Thanks, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think the question is so easily answered yes, emphatically, by what we're doing here today. U.S., Europe, still in it together here in the heart of Europe at GLOBSEC, and I'm delighted that you mentioned Normandy, not just because I think we were all moved by the ceremonies, the commemorations. My grandfather, the son of German immigrants, I would add, was a naval officer, United States naval officer in World War II, and landed at Normandy. Earlier, he'd been in North Africa, in Sicily, the Italian campaigns, landing in Salerno, in Napoli, in Anzio, and then came around for D-Day. And so while he may not have had a chance to encounter directly your father,
we were still on the same side.
We were on the same side, and we still are very much. And that was evident, I think, yesterday.
Yep.
We've heard this morning from the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, General Walters, my former boss, my colleague, my friend. And we're reminded that General Eisenhower was the Supreme Allied Commander, the first one. And so this is the legacy of what we did together 75 years ago. You mentioned that 20 years ago we were at Rambouillet, historic times then, but I think being here in Bratislava, we're reminded even more that 30 years ago, you know, we were seeing seismic events in 1989, the fall of communism in Central Europe. I happened to be a student living in Berlin the day, November 9th, when the wall came down. And you don't forget those things, and you realize how history's arc is not at all preordained. I think one other point I would make that underscores that the US and Europe are still in it together is that while we celebrate and remember what happened 30 years ago here in Central Europe, this week, 30 years ago, on the exact same day, in fact, that the Poles were voting in the first partially free elections in the Soviet bloc, the Chinese military was massacring peaceful protesters in Tiananmen Square. And that brutality and repression and crackdown offers a stark reminder to what we've actually accomplished, again, together, particularly in these past 30 years, and that, you know, history can swing both ways, and the people of this region, with the full support of the United States, took a particular direction, looking west, engaging in robust, sometimes fractious conversations. But yes, indeed, the answer to the question is we are very much still in it together, and never mind tweets. Listen to what the president says. Listen to what the Vice President, Secretary Pompeo have said repeatedly. We remain ironclad bound to the success of NATO, to the Article 5 commitments. This is the backbone of US security policy. It's that transatlantic security which has given us the stability and indeed the prosperity that my grandfather and your father 75 years ago on the beaches of Normandy even then could never have imagined.
Well, do we obviously have a lot of good, positive history in common, and that was then, but this is now. Do we still, do you think, have the same threat perception? Do you think there are threats that the United States perceives that the Europeans haven't got real to yet?
You know, I think that's a great question. We do have different perceptions, and we always have, and that's what an alliance and certainly diplomacy, and dare I say, events like this are all about: exchanging views on those perceptions, helping one another understand the threat that Iran poses. And I think there's broad recognition, for instance, of the common threat that Iran poses, the malign influence, the financing of terrorism that threatens Americans and Europeans.
So Iran is one of those threats.
Things.
What other threats would you say there are where perhaps there are perception gaps in your view that are important in?
Well, I think what you actually see is great unity on a number of things. When you look at Russia, for instance, which I think is probably something you're referring to, across the board there is a unity, for instance, on the malign action, what Russia has done to undermine the INF treaty, for example, and the steps that we've taken to say we want to pursue arms control, but it can't be one-sided. And we've seen the support for that. We've seen the support for Ukraine, a country that is currently being occupied, where a war is still taking the toll here in Europe, frankly, not that far from where we sit today. And there's unity amongst the allies in how we respond to that.
Our response hasn't been hugely effective, has it?
These things take time. And I think in Ukraine in particular, we have a great new opportunity. The people of Ukraine have spoken, I think, extremely formidably through an election of a new president. We'll soon have an election of a new government. And I just met President Zelensky in Brussels on his first trip outside of Ukraine since becoming president. And we hosted a dinner for him as well, to talk about what we can all do together to support Ukraine, and that includes helping to bring peace there. And that's, of course, going to take a real commitment by President Putin and the Russians as well to live up to the obligations that they've undertaken.
We'll maybe come on to China later, but one thing I think that most Europeans feel is that we're not so sure that we're still in it together when it comes to multilateralism, when it comes to the rules-based global order. And incidentally, you're all very free and very welcome to put questions via Slido. I will see your questions and put them to Phil if you have questions, so please do that. The rules-based order, multilateralism, are we still in it together?
Absolutely. I mean, I think at last count, we're still involved in over 1,000 multilateral institutions, many, if not most of which, the United States was very much involved in creating. So many of them in the early years after the victory at the end of World War II, particularly in the transatlantic space. And again, it's those institutions that have allowed us to have the stability, security, and prosperity that we've enjoyed, unprecedented, really, in human history. Secretary Pompeo has talked about the need for strategic renovation, and I think that's something that really everybody can agree with. We have to look at what are these institutions, multilateral, bilateral, trilateral, what are they doing, what are they accomplishing, how can they be renovated and updated for the challenges of the 21st century, and that's what we're dedicated to. I would just add, I think a lot of the neuralgia and focus on this has come out of a set of steps that we took, the United States took early in the Trump administration. And one was, of course, the Paris Climate Accord.
Yeah.
I would just suggest that you look at our focus on results and find out what country has seen the greatest reduction in CO2 emissions.
You're doing
since
it in
that
practice,
time.
but not in theory, as Madam Albright would have said.
And so, take a look at those results and how we can still work together on these things, utilizing technology, for instance. Another, and comes back to the point of Iran, the JCPOA, something the administration had said all along, we couldn't agree to that because it allowed Iran the opportunity to continue enriching itself and channeling those funds in enormous ways, not to the Iranian people, but to actors like Hezbollah, the Quds Force, who were bent on not only the destruction of Israel and attacking American interests and European interests right here, often in the heart of Europe. And so we continue to work often with the same goals, but through different means.
But those means that's fine as long as we have the same objective and as long as we're not doing it by beggaring our own neighbors. But when it comes to imposing extraterritorial sanctions on European companies that deal with Iran or that deal with Cuba, on the basis of agreements that we signed together and which were endorsed by a United Nations resolution, can we still be in it together if we're sanctioning each other?
Look, I think we all are sovereign countries, and we have to take the steps that we believe are necessary. We went through a process with a lot of discussion and negotiation, notification of what we were going to do in that case, and we're obviously still talking about these issues. We have a special envoy, Brian Hook, who deals with Iran in our case, and he is regularly doing the rounds not only of gatherings like this, but bilaterally and multilaterally with our allies and friends to be very clear about what we are trying to accomplish. And the President has made clear, as Secretary Pompeo reminded us, that he's ready to sit down with Iran and have a talk about them becoming a normal country that's not threatening its neighbors or us.
So we're on the hook, as it were. Well, that leads me into my next question, and fortunately, somebody has contributed a Slido question that fits in with that. Are we still in it together about Europe whole and free? Now, the reason I ask that is because whole, you know, your president has been cheerleading for Brexit, which is about dividing Europe, and has caused quite a lot of concern about, you know, the question of does he really support the European Union, European integration, which is something the United States has done historically ever since the end of the Second World War with the Marshall Plan. We come out of that, but today there is that question in a lot of people's minds. And Europe free, do we still support together? Are we in it together when it comes to the rule of law, media freedom in countries like Hungary and Poland? We used to feel we could count on the United States, and the United States even would push us and say, you know, you ought to be tougher on these guys. We're not quite there now. So are we still in this together, Europe whole and free?
I think the answer is absolutely. Our engagement with the European Union and its institutions is as robust as ever. I've just come from Brussels. Our ambassador to the European Union, Ambassador Gordon Sondland, who I think will be speaking here later, is actively involved in all corners of the continent and back and forth to Washington, extremely active. He was with me and our energy secretary at the forCEE Initiative Summit in Ljubljana just yesterday. We were hosting President Zelensky and other European leaders in Brussels earlier in the week. That kind of engagement goes on all the time. The President has spoken about Brexit in the context of what the British people voted for in their democratic referendum process. What we've also always said is we look forward to having a vibrant, stronger relationship with the UK and with the EU. And we're very much dedicated, guys like me in my role and Secretary Pompeo, to pursuing that. When it comes to whole, we look to the Western Balkans, for instance, where the backbone of our policy, and I worked on this for most of my professional career, is about integration of all of those countries as their stated desire into the European Union and
so
into
do you have
NATO.
a dissatisfaction with the EU that they're not moving fast enough on that, frustration?
Well, look, if you take the example of North Macedonia, a country that has defied the historic connotations. You know, long ago, Bismarck and others spoke about the Macedonia question and the problem of that. And in fact, they've shown that they're the answer, a multi-ethnic democratic state with the rule of law and dealing with all the challenges that we all do, who overcame great historic challenges by working with their neighbor Greece to come to the Prespa agreement. We've shown that our commitment was solid. They're on their way to NATO membership. The US Senate will take that up this fall. I think they've just passed the halfway mark in terms of ratifications. They will be the 30th member of NATO. And we very much want to see, as we've supported as part of our foreign policy, the European perspective, the path towards full EU membership for all of those countries that wish it. So we'd like to see that move along. I think North Macedonia in particular has really done all that's asked of them, and there's a historic opportunity here to take those century-old questions and celebrate the resolution of them and look at that as something that we've done through the transatlantic institutions.
A couple more questions from the floor. How far can we go to keep Belarus as an independent state, is one. Another one, there are a couple about defense. One is Fort Trump realistic at all? In Poland, that's something I wrote a whole report about, incidentally. Which,
thank you for the copy.
Right. But somebody else said, you know, you keep banging on about how we must do more on defense. And the very moment that we start doing it with PESCO and the European Defense Fund, we get criticized for it. So could you like to address those two?
Let me take the last one first, since it's something I was talking about earlier today. We welcome very much the European Defense Fund and the PESCO structure, which of course is something we've encouraged for decades. And what we've seen literally in the last 2 years is an incredible coming together of the EU and NATO. And both of our missions at NATO and our US mission to the EU have been vital in that. I'd worked a lot on this from US European Command to see an engagement that is a multiplier, that doesn't substitute for NATO, which is our strongest security link and has made enormous and very positive changes and developments to deal with the current threats.
So why the criticism?
What we're alarmed about there is language in the specific elements that on principle would exclude third country participation. And that's not just for the United States, it's for other non-EU members who may also be NATO members. Norway, for instance, the UK perhaps after Brexit, which we don't see as at all necessary, and in fact could countermand the great progress we've made, and is outlined in two documents, EU NATO declarations from 2016 and 2018. So we've had conversations about that. Again, that's diplomacy. I've talked about it with EU counterparts, with individual member state representatives, and we'll continue to do that.
Belarus?
Belarus is a sovereign country. In fact, I just met with the Belarus Deputy Foreign Minister in Washington about 2-3 weeks ago. We had a very moving event for Holocaust Remembrance Day, commemorating the uprising in the Minsk ghetto. And we would like to see our own bilateral relationship with Belarus be better. They are an independent and sovereign country that we work with and will continue to work with. And I think all of Europe should be similarly reaching out to see where we can help Belarus in their own path forward.
Question from Wojciech Przybylski in the audience brings us back to that question I asked you about the state of freedom and human rights in Central Europe. What will the administration do to press the concerns of Congress about the state of media freedom and the rule of law in Hungary and in Poland in particular? We saw Mr. Orban in the Oval Office, and maybe my ears need cleaning out, but I must have missed the bits where they talked about the rule of law, media freedom, and so on. You know, it was there was.
That's why we don't keep the microphones on during the whole meeting.
But what you say when the microphones are on counts too, Phil, and the microphones are on now. So this is.
Look, I think we've made very clear when we have concerns. Our focus is the strong belief that across Europe, and again, we're commemorating that, the 30th anniversary of that this year. We share a broad, similar set of values. And that's clearly what the people of the region, and I spent a lot of my years in Hungary, here in Slovakia, the Czech Republic, certainly Poland. We talked about the first elections they were having 30 years ago, what they called for. And I think in recent elections we've seen that reiterated. In Romania, strong statements about the importance of rule of law. We raise these with each country individually. We have conversations. Secretary Pompeo has been very clear that even when you have concerns and criticism, that you need to have engagement, whether it's in the Oval Office or on visits we make to those countries or at fora like this, because criticism without engagement can lead to estrangement. And that's not what anybody's after. Instead, it's talking about these issues, using the basis of our relationship and our alliance. And after all, we're talking about allies here. The President of Poland will be in Washington next week. I met with him just this week at the forCEE initiative. So there's a constant dialogue about these.
And they are pushing very hard for a permanent U.S. military base, that what was referred to as Fort Trump. Are they going to get that? And is there some conditionality there that might, with the rule of law and so on, that might give you some leverage on that?
Well, I'm certainly not going to preempt or get ahead of the president or anybody else in making announcements, but we've been very clear about the conversations we've been having with Poland, a strong ally. You're all aware of the enhanced forward presence through NATO that has involved Poland as well. And so those kinds of conversations continue. Again, the President Duda will be visiting Washington next week. But this again illustrates the continuity of engagement and very much answers your question. The US and Europe, yes, still together in so many different dynamics.
So can we still be, let's move a little bit on to economics, to trade. And can we still be in it together if we're slapping tariffs on each other's imports?
What we have to do is, again, talk about those issues too. What President Trump has made very clear is that trade is something very important to him, and he recognizes that the EU-US trade relationship is the largest in the world. It's over $1 trillion a year.
Yep.
That's not going away. What he identified and what the American electorate also identified is that there are some inequities and unfairness in that relationship. There are barriers to U.S. products in Europe that European exporters don't face in the United States, and he wants to address those issues. We have structures and ways of doing that. As you know, he recently directed our U.S. Trade Representative, Mr. Lighthizer, to take the next 6 months and look at how we can deal, for instance, in the automotive sector for cars and auto parts, which is vital interest for this region, and how we can overcome those so that we end up with a level playing field in which we can all compete to the betterment of all of our economies.
These are issues on which friends and allies should negotiate and cooperate. Are they issues that threaten each other's national security?
I think we have to look broadly now at the economics of national security.
So the number of Mercedes on Fifth Avenue is a national security issue?
I haven't been counting, but the concept of level playing fields is indeed an aspect of national security, because we're experiencing in the United States now a strong, vibrant economy. We want that for Europe as well, and we believe that by eliminating many of these barriers and inequities, we can all benefit.
Well, your economy is certainly powering ahead, and the main obstacle to that continuing would seem to be the risk of a trade war.
Nobody wants a trade war. Nobody wants any kind of wars, and we have these terrific transatlantic structures and institutions of all kinds, economic, security-based, and diplomatic, to address those things. And I'm very confident that we can, and certainly that's been Secretary Pompeo's message. And when he asked me to take on this role, it was very much about engagement to deal with these issues, sometimes difficult, sometimes tense, But that's what happens among friends and family members, and that's really what we are. Again, as we recognize 75 years since we undertook this great adventure.
We're coming towards the end, but I can't stop without asking you a question about relations with Germany. I can't remember a time when relations between the United States and Germany were as scratchy, tense, poor as they are now. If Nord Stream 2 goes ahead, what will that mean for those relations?
I think we've been clear that we see Nord Stream 2 as an unfortunate political project. You know, as we've already said and reiterated, and there should be no doubt, we are absolutely all in and committed to NATO and leadership in NATO. But it's difficult, you know, defending the West when they become reliant on the East. And so energy diversification, and not giving to Russia, in this case, a tool by which to hold sway over important economies in Europe, and energy is key there, is one challenge there. So that's something we felt strongly about, and we've made our views known.
Strongly enough to use sanctions as a tool there?
I don't want to prejudge anything there. I think we have strong conversations, as we did at the forCEE initiative, where we're an observer, about the importance of energy diversity and diversification. And I think you're having that conversation right here in Europe among members of the European Union as well.
Phil, Rika, thank you very much. Before I want you go, I want to thank everybody in the audience for your questions and for your time. Thank Phil for his answers,
Thanks,
which
Paul.
were very straight. Thank you. And may you be heard in Washington as well as in Bratislava, Phil.
And we're competing for lunch. So
Right.
you can go now.
And after lunch, thank you. After lunch, the next session in this very room, is about Europe flexing its muscles. So don't miss that. Be back to watch Europe flex its muscles.